We have an online question from Heather, and she's asking, what can we do about replacing ESEA or preventing centralized education?
Heather, so you're referring to the ESEA, which was passed today by the Senate. I voted against it. This is federal legislation governing elementary and secondary education. And it sounds like you, have real concerns with this, and that's why I voted against it. Let me tell you why I voted against it and why this bill bothers me. I believe that decisions governing public education, decisions governing elementary and secondary education, need to be made at the most local level possible. They need to be made by teachers in consultation with parents, principals, local school officials, and in some cases, statewide officials as well. But they should not be made, ever, by federal officials in Washington, D.C. Now, while federal officials in Washington, D.C. might be the appropriate people to decide education policy for public schools in the District of Columbia, or perhaps in U.S. territories, or perhaps schools operated on and by the U.S. military, on U.S. military bases, they're not the appropriate entities to be making education policy, setting educational curriculum standards for public schools within states. This is a state prerogative. We live under a constitutional system in which any power not given to the federal government is reserved to the states. Now, public education is not a power that's given by the Constitution to Congress. It's therefore reserved to the states, and that's where it needs to be. Public education operates much better when we allow this natural constitutional process to play out. We allow each state to serve as its own laboratory of Republican democracy. Each state can tailor-make its own public education system to meet its own unique needs, to deal with its own unique challenges. The problems we've had in recent years have been compounded by Congress's passage by a Republican Congress of legislation called No Child Left Behind. Sadly, this was passed into law by a Republican Congress and signed into law by a Republican president. This is a stain on the Republican Party and a decision that most Republicans have appropriately regretted. We've been trying to figure out how to get states out of the grasp of this awful law. We had an opportunity to do that with this bill that was passed in the Senate today, and the version of it that was originally enacted by the House of Representatives a few months ago took us a few steps, at least in the right direction, toward achieving greater autonomy and control on the part of the states, giving parents additional choices with regard to whether or not to opt their children out of federally mandated testing, and giving parents some additional autonomy with respect to school choice, giving the states the ability to develop their own curriculum standards, free of the oppressive threat of a veto by the Secretary of Education. Unfortunately, the legislation that was passed by the Senate today and had been passed last week by the House of Representatives didn't retain any of those provisions. In fact, this legislation that was passed today strengthened and reiterated the authority of the U.S. Secretary of Education to veto the education plan of any state for basically any reason or no reason at all. Now, sure, the bill paid lip service to the idea that the Secretary of Education shouldn't be able to micromanage education decisions adopted by a state. But that really is meaningless, considering, number one, there was similar language in No Child Left Behind, and number two, it still leaves in the hands of the Secretary of Education the power to veto any state's decision. It does, moreover, expand the financial footprint of the federal government in public education. So these are the reasons why I felt the need to vote against it. And you've got my commitment that I'm going to continue to fight as long as I'm privileged to represent Utah in the United States Senate, to fight to return more and more local autonomy back to the states where it properly belongs. This bill moved it in the opposite direction, and this bill postponed a lot of these decisions until 2020, which is a big problem and one of the reasons why I voted against it.